survivors, and welcome to the Swedish Survival channel. Today we're going to speak about something that lies very close to my heart, and that is the great defense of the nation Sweden and the crisis preparedness of the nation Sweden.
About a year ago, the Swedish government handed out the booklet If Crisis or War Comes, as well as some other booklets, a bit of a thinner booklet, directed towards people of age 18, such as myself. Some weeks after these booklets were handed out, Sweden mobilized the Home Guard. The Home Guard, which is a national security force which is supposed to aid Sweden in the act of war or in the act of a crisis such as forest fires and such. Not only that, but it was now also decided that Sweden is to put troops on a small island called Gotland, an important military resource and strategic resource in the event of war with the eastern parts of Europe. But let us go back and let's look at history. How did this all come to be? How did Sweden suddenly increase its military capacity? Why was this booklet handed out? And especially, why is Sweden afraid of the eastern parts of Europe? In 2014, the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency pointed out how weak the Swedish military and the Swedish emergency preparedness is. In the event of a crisis, Sweden will lose 50% of its important fossil fuels as well as its food. Now, the reality is actually much worse than this. Sweden would lose both food and water and fossil fuels within weeks. Those would become scarce very, very fast. The most urgent of them would be the water supply. Sweden does not have enough water to supply even 300,000 people for a single day. That is with 3 liters per person counted. The same year, in 2014, Swedish emergency preparedness was put to a test when a large forest fire broke out in an area called Västmanland. The Swedish government, the Swedish state, did not have anywhere near enough resources to combat the fire. This led to civilians having to step in to try and save their homes. This was also repeated in the forest fires of 2018, when we thought that our emergency preparedness might have been a little bit better. Turns out that did not happen. Anyway, in both cases, both in 2014 and 2018, it was concluded that the emergency preparedness of civilians was very low. A lot of civilians had to step in and help their neighbors, and also had to help out the Swedish state in combating the fire. Now you might see that there is a problem with a lot of civilians becoming reliant on the Swedish state as well as neighbors. It proves for a lot of chaos, let's just say. Because of this crisis, the Swedish government assigned a mission to the agency to enhance and strengthen the way that Sweden deals with a crisis. Later in 2016, the Swedish government made a report on emergency preparedness in Sweden and concluded that it was very insufficient. This was concluded after a report made by the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency after the fires in Västmanland. Following this, the moderate party in Sweden, Moderaterna in Swedish, took it upon themselves to say that we need to improve our emergency preparedness on a national level. In the same report, the Social Democrats suggested that because of the heightened international threat, we have to strengthen our preparedness on a national level, but they also mentioned the importance of individual preparedness. The reason they do this is because they point to a report made by the Swedish Committee of Defense back in 2015. If you're ever wondering or want to do some further reading, the links will all be down in the description. After that report, a website called dinsäkerhet.se, or roughly translated into yoursecurity.se, was to be given attention to, since the counties in Sweden got a mission to spread the word of emergency preparedness and what enhanced height of readiness means. It was then concluded that this attempt to spread the information had failed and that more measures were needed to improve Swedish emergency preparedness. Finally, in 2017, the government assigned another mission to the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency to spread more knowledge about this. This eventually led to the publication and spread of Crisis or War Comes. Not only this, but they also made a number of YouTube videos, which you can see here right now, as well as they will be linked down in the description. As the agency released the booklets as well as the YouTube videos, they also released the reasons for it. They write in a report published along with the booklet. In the event of a crisis or enhanced height of readiness, people are expected to as much as possible take responsibility for themselves. To do this the best way possible, it is essential that one is prepared. A lot of people today lack the knowledge of what responsibility they have and how to prepare for a crisis, enhanced height of readiness, or othermost war. The knowledge of what enhanced height of readiness means and how to act in such a situation has been concluded to be low. Having good knowledge on how to prepare for different types of crises become more and more important. The changed climate causes risk for extreme weather conditions and natural disasters to increase. The worsening security situation also makes it important that people know what enhanced height of readiness means and how they can prepare for it. This was then published in the report, which you can also find in the description below. And just so that you guys understand, enhanced height of readiness means that the Swedish government says that the country has been stricken by a national crisis. In practice, this means that Sweden mobilizes the military and that everyone that has the duty to work during these times must also do so. This also gives the Swedish state the option to occupy private property for various reasons, military reasons or resources or so on. It is pretty obvious that Sweden is enhancing the way we handle crises because of the amount of crises we've had in the last years. A lot of people seem to think that we are going back to the amount of preparedness we had during the Cold War, especially because of the increased military action we've had in Sweden the last couple of years. It all started with the exercise Aurora 17, which was largely criticized, and many groups and activists actually tried to stop the exercise. Many called it an act of war and that it would ruin the neutrality of Sweden.
For us, war is not some heroic actions. It's always violence against women, against the child, and so on. So I think it's ridiculous.
Aurora 17 was carried out because the situation here in Europe has changed over the last couple of years and that the Swedish defense needs to be strengthened. It was also carried out so that Sweden knew how to help international partners, such as England, such as the NATO countries, if Sweden was to be struck by an armed conflict. Along with this, Sweden also brought back mandatory military service as well as creating a bigger funding for the military. Along with this, the Swedish Defence Force took it upon themselves to make working in the military more attractive and have made various campaigns, like this one.
Du som är feminist. Du som också är feminist.
Now, you might argue that this was not largely successful. It received quite a lot of criticism because they are trying to be inclusive and so on. Sweden recently put a new regiment on Gotland, and this is the first time we've had a regiment or stationary soldiers there since the Second World War. The Swedish Prime Minister Stefan Löfven said this about the action. We should show that we have military muscles on Gotland. It's a clear signal to the rest of the world. We successively improve our defense capability. We have seen what has happened in Ukraine, where Crimea is under annexation and there is an ongoing conflict in the eastern parts of the country. We have more activity in the Baltic Sea, not least by the Russians. We need to adapt to that to keep our country safe and sound. So here, the Prime Minister is basically saying we are preparing for a war with Russia. This year, just some weeks ago, we had the National Preparedness Week. This is a week basically focused on prepping and preparedness. I think this comes to show that preppers are not just paranoid Boy Scouts, as often mentioned by popular culture and by the majority of people, I would say. I think it's great that Sweden takes the initiative to make every citizen prepared for a crisis or war. As we preppers know, it is not a question of if, it's a question of when. To come to a conclusion here, Sweden is definitely putting a lot of resources to increase our defense capability as well as the emergency preparedness. There has been a rehabilitation of the Swedish defense with Russia as the obvious threat. Sweden did something great here to realize that the national preparedness needs improving as well as informing the population of what crisis or what war might actually mean. Anyway, that was all for this video and I hope you stayed with me. It might be a bit I wouldn't say boring, because this is quite an important topic, especially for us Swedes. But anyway, so please tell me if you would want more of these investigative and evaluating videos. Lastly, I want to say that all the sources are down in the description, as I've mentioned a couple of times in this video already. And anyway, if there was anything you think I missed or should have brought up more clearly or want me to evaluate on, please let me know down in the comments. And I think that was all. So